In the shadowed corridors of wartime Europe, long before the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, an unlikely figure began to weave one of the greatest deceptions in modern history. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, a former poultry farmer and failed businessman from Barcelona, who would soon be known to both Berlin and London by a single name, Garbo. He was not a soldier, not a trained spy, but a man armed with little more than audacity and an unwavering hatred of tyranny. It began in 1941. Europe lay under the iron heel of Nazi Germany. France had fallen, the Luftwaffe had bombed London relentlessly, and the Axis seemed unstoppable. From his neutral perch in Lisbon, Pujol watched as totalitarianism consumed nations. He made a personal decision. He would fight Hitler in the only way he could, through deception. But neither the British nor the Americans would have him. MI6 dismissed his offers of service, calling him unqualified and unreliable. Undeterred, he turned to Germany. With nothing but imagination, Pujol crafted an identity, a fanatically pro-Nazi Spanish government official living in London. Through ingenuity, he convinced the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, to recruit him. His first fabricated reports were written not from London, but from a small hotel room in Lisbon, using newspapers, outdated maps, and BBC broadcasts to create the illusion of a British spy network. He invented an entire roster of informants, dock workers, RAF officers, even civil servants, and gave each of them names, personalities, and lives that existed only in his mind. By early 1942, his dispatches began to reach Berlin through Abwehr agent Karl Erich Kühlenthal. The Germans were impressed. Pujol's supposed network was meticulous, delivering first-hand intelligence on British troop movements and convoy schedules. The information was convincing because it was mixed with truth, small, verifiable, details gleaned from public sources, wrapped around a core of deliberate falsehoods. Every letter, written in invisible ink, was smuggled through the Spanish diplomatic pouch to Madrid, then sent onward to Berlin. But maintaining this illusion was perilous. Pujol needed to keep his lies believable without revealing his absence from Britain. He sent reports describing rain-soaked London streets, food rationing and blackouts, details the Germans could cross-check with radio broadcasts. His dedication was obsessive. "I will build a web of falsehoods so intricate," he wrote in Sarfos, a letter to his wife Araceli, "that even the spider will not find its way out." His ingenuity soon attracted the attention of British intelligence after a series of German communications mentioned a mysterious agent in London who seemed to have deep penetration into British society. MI5's counterintelligence officers began tracing the source, and by mid-1942 they located Pujol, still operating from Lisbon. Rather than arrest him, they made a bold choice to bring him to London and transform his self-made deception into an official double-agent operation. Pujol arrived in Britain under heavy secrecy in April 1942. He was assigned to MI5's Double Cross Division under the supervision of Case Officer Thomas Harris, himself fluent in Spanish and skilled in psychological operations. Together, they began shaping Pujol's reports into precision tools of wartime misinformation. The fake spy network, now 27 agents strong, was expanded into an elaborate hierarchy of imaginary individuals, engineers, naval officers, and clerks scattered across Britain. Each had a detailed backstory, expense accounts, and even payroll records, all fictional, all meticulously maintained by MI5. His codename became Garbo, in homage to the actress Greta Garbo, an allusion to his ability to perform roles convincingly. The Germans, unaware of the British control, paid him regularly through Swiss banks. Every pound of that money was pocketed by MI5 and used to fund actual operations. His messages were no longer handwritten, they were transmitted via radio, coded in cipher, and sent through controlled Abwehr channels to ensure interception by Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. As the reports grew in frequency, Berlin's confidence in Garbo deepened. They viewed him as one of their most valuable operatives in Britain. But behind the smoke and mirrors, Garbo was already serving the Allied cause. his lies now part of a grander strategy to manipulate German intelligence on a global scale. One Abwehr officer later wrote, "We believed him implicitly. His precision was unmatched, his dedication beyond question." What they could not see was the invisible hand of MI5, shaping every word he sent. By the end of 1942, Garbo's network had become a living organism within the war's intelligence system, a phantom army of names that existed only in coded transmissions and Abwehr files. From Lisbon to London, the game of shadows was now underway. But the question lingered in Garbo's mind. How far could the lie be stretched before it snapped? As the Allies planned new offensives and the Germans grew desperate for information, the world's most improbable spy stood at the threshold of deception's greatest test, one that would decide the fate of Europe itself. By the dawn of 1943, Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, was no longer a mere pretender. Under MI5's guidance, he had evolved into one of Britain's most sophisticated weapons of deception. The network he had invented from the smoke of imagination now existed in official German records as a living, breathing spy organization. It was known to the Abwehr as one of their most valuable intelligence assets inside Britain, and every false word Garbo transmitted was shaping the enemy's perception of the war. London at that time was a city under siege, not from bombs, but from secrecy. Beneath the calm of its wartime blackouts, MI5's B1A section worked in a maze of offices at 58 St. James's Street. The double-cross system, led by Lieutenant Colonel Tar Robertson, had successfully turned nearly every German agent sent to the British Isles. But Garbo was different. He was not captured. He had created himself. That made him unpredictable, yet uniquely powerful. Under the watchful supervision of his handler, Thomas Harris, Garbo crafted elaborate backstories for each of his imaginary sub-agents. Number 6, supposedly a Scottish nationalist in Glasgow. Number 14, an anti-fascist steward on transatlantic ships. Number 21, a female typist in Whitehall. Each one existed on paper, received fictitious pay, and sent field reports that Garbo alone wrote, by hand, in code, sometimes over 60 pages long. MI5 officers joked that he was running an entire army of ghosts. To maintain his credibility with the Germans, Garbo's intelligence had to contain enough truth to appear authentic. He was given controlled leaks, details of convoy departures that were already obsolete, reports on RAF airfields that had changed operational status. His letters reached the Abwehr through Lisbon and Madrid, funneled via German agents such as Karl Erich Kuhlenthal and encoded in the Abwehr's cipher system. The British, thanks to Bletchley Park's ultra-decrypts, could read the enemy's responses almost as quickly as Garbo could invent his next lie. The strategic importance of his work grew rapidly. In early 1943, Berlin's High Command began using his reports to corroborate reconnaissance on Allied naval activity in the Atlantic. They believed he had eyes in Liverpool, Southampton, and Portsmouth. In one transmission, Garbo warned that a large convoy was preparing to sail toward Malta. Information that diverted German submarines for weeks, wasting precious resources and fuel. MI5 later noted with satisfaction that the Germans accepted the information as gospel. Still, Garbo's existence depended on balance. If his fabrications were too grand, the Germans might suspect. If too timid, they would lose interest. Harris and Garbo developed a rhythm of deception. Truth laced with delay, accuracy salted with just enough error to make Berlin trust him even more. "The Germans must never think you are perfect," Harris advised. "They must think you are human." The work was grueling. Garbo spent long nights in candle-lit rooms, dictating coded messages while London's air raid sirens echoed outside. He grew pale, exhausted but relentless. In his personal diary, he confessed, "I live between two worlds, the one I serve and the one I deceive. I do not know which of them is more real anymore." As 1943 unfolded, the Allied command began to see Garbo's potential beyond mere misinformation. With the North African campaign nearing its conclusion and the invasion of Sicily on the horizon, deception became a weapon of necessity. MI5 and the London Controlling Section, the secret group responsible for Allied deception planning, realized that Garbo could play a central role in misdirecting the Axis High Command. His credibility was now a strategic asset. In May 1943, Garbo transmitted one of his most significant reports to date. He claimed that the Allies were massing troops in Scotland for an invasion of Norway. The Germans reacted immediately, diverting attention and defensive forces northward, while Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, struck from the south. It was a perfect illusion, and Garbo's standing with the Abwehr reached new heights. The Germans even increased his pay and sent him a personal commendation. Meanwhile, MI5 continued to refine his communications. His messages, once carried by mail, were now transmitted via radio from a secret facility in London. German officers, monitoring his frequencies, believed they were hearing a man embedded deep within British society. In truth, every signal was scripted, reviewed, and timed to synchronize with Allied operational goals. By late 1943, Garbo's mythos had solidified. His 27 agents were considered indispensable to the Abwehr's network in Britain. His words reached directly to the desk of General Alfred Jodl at the OKW, influencing decisions at the highest level of the German war effort. One report, later discovered among captured German archives, labeled Garbo one of the most valuable agents in England. But as the months advanced, so too did the stakes. The Allies were preparing for the most ambitious operation of the war, an invasion of Western Europe. For it to succeed, the enemy would have to believe it would strike somewhere else entirely. And among the vast machinery of spies, signals, and deception, one man stood at the center, Agent Garbo, the double agent who had fooled Moscow, Berlin, and perhaps even himself. The War of Shadows was about to reach its climax, and Garbo was about to perform the most dangerous act of his life. In the early months of 1944, Europe teetered on the brink of invasion. From Moscow to Berlin, Allied and Axis analysts pored over intercepted messages, troop movements, and maps covered in red arrows pointing toward the French coastline. Everyone knew the Allies were preparing to return to the continent. But where and when remained the deadliest secret of the war. In this high-stakes game of deception, Agent Garbo would become a central player, weaving illusions that would help determine the fate of D-Day. The operation had a name: Fortitude. It was part of a vast Allied plan known as Bodyguard, designed to conceal the true target of the 1944 invasion. The Germans expected a landing in northern France, but the Allies wanted them to believe the blow would fall on the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and the continent. Everything depended on convincing Hitler and his generals that Normandy was merely a feint, and for that illusion to hold, the Allies needed someone the Germans trusted completely. That someone was Agent Garbo. Operating from a small room in London, Garbo and his MI5 handler, Thomas Harris, began to craft one of history's greatest acts of misinformation. Through his fictitious spy network of 27 agents, Garbo reported troop movements, supply buildups, and naval deployments, all pointing toward a massive invasion force gathering in southeast England. His radio messages, filled with the hum of static and coded precision, were transmitted to the Abwehr station in Madrid, then forwarded to Berlin, where analysts charted every word as gospel truth. One of Garbo's imaginary agents, a captain in the US Army stationed near Dover, reported the presence of General George S. Patton. This detail wasn't random. The Allies had deliberately assigned Patton, their most aggressive and visible commander, to head the fictitious 1st US Army Group, FUSAG. In reality, FUSAG existed only on paper. A phantom army built with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and radio chatter broadcast by British operators posing as entire divisions. Together, Garbo's reports and the physical illusions created by the Royal Engineers formed a masterpiece of deception, Operation Fortitude South. In his transmissions, Garbo wrote of endless convoys assembling at ports like Dover, Folkestone, and Canterbury. He described naval rehearsals in the English Channel and stockpiles of landing craft along the coast. Every detail, down to the pattern of traffic jams on country roads, was fabricated or staged by Allied planners. The invasion, Garbo warned his Abwehr handlers in April 1944, will strike at Calais in early summer, when the weather turns. His information was so detailed that Berlin postponed troop movements from the Pas de Calais sector, keeping divisions on high alert long after D-Day had passed. But the deception had to walk a razor's edge between credibility and exposure. A single inconsistency could unravel years of careful manipulation. To maintain trust, Garbo even sacrificed smaller lies. In one report, He claimed his agents had failed to deliver information in time for the Germans to stop a real Allied bombing raid. His regret sounded so genuine that Berlin commended his honesty under pressure. That small act of self-sabotage cemented his credibility. Then came June 6, 1944. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy under a sky filled with smoke and the thunder of naval guns. Even as German soldiers fought desperately to repel the assault, Berlin still refused to believe it was the main invasion. Garbo's messages continued to flow, assuring the Abwehr that Normandy was merely a diversion, a prelude to the real assault at Calais. "The principal attack is yet to come," he reported calmly, even as the Allies established a firm beachhead on the Normandy coast. The success was astonishing. For nearly 7 weeks after D-Day, the German 15th Army, over 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks, remained stationed near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never arrive. Hitler himself ordered the troops to hold position, refusing to redeploy them to Normandy. By the time he realized the deception, the Allies had broken through at Saint-Lô and were racing across France. Within the Allied command, Garbo's name became legend. His reports were read at the highest levels, with some officers calling him our silent division. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later credited the success of Operation Fortitude with saving thousands of lives during the Normandy campaign. Without it, the German response would have been swifter, stronger, and bloodier. Yet even at the height of his triumph, Garbo's double life grew darker. He knew that every message he sent deceived men who trusted him, men who were dying in battles shaped by his words. The psychological toll was immense. In his notes, he wrote, "I have told so many lies that I fear truth itself may no longer recognize me." His wife Araceli, still living under an assumed identity, begged him to leave the service, but Garbo refused. He believed that only by completing his mission could he redeem the lies he had spun. As summer turned to autumn in 1944, Allied troops advanced toward Paris, and German resistance began to crumble. But for Garbo, the success of Operation Fortitude was not an ending. It was a dangerous new beginning. His German handlers adored him, his British masters revered him, and somewhere in the chaos of collapsing empires, both sides believed he was theirs alone. What neither knew was that the world's greatest deceiver was about to become invisible. The summer of 1944 marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Allied troops pushed inland from the beaches of Normandy, liberating town after town, while Soviet forces advanced relentlessly from the east. Yet even as the Third Reich began to crumble, the Abwehr, Germany's once feared intelligence service, remained steadfast in its faith in one man, Agent Garbo. To Berlin, he was a hero of the Reich. To London, he was the greatest double agent of the war. From his small office in London, hidden behind unmarked doors and blackout curtains, Juan Pujol Garcia worked tirelessly with his MI5 case officer Thomas Harris. Together, they refined every coded message that passed through his radio transmitter. The Germans believed they were receiving privileged intelligence from a trusted insider at the heart of British military planning. In reality, every word was crafted by British counterintelligence and timed with surgical precision to mislead, delay, and confuse. Following the success of Operation Fortitude, Garbo's reputation in Berlin soared to legendary status. Abwehr officers praised his accuracy and the reliability of his supposed network of 27 sub-agents. To honor his loyalty and contribution, the German High Command awarded him the Iron Cross, personally authorized by Adolf Hitler. The irony was staggering. Garbo received the Iron Cross for his role in ensuring the failure of Germany's greatest defensive battle, but the honors didn't stop there. Within MI5, Garbo's contribution had not gone unnoticed. In a confidential ceremony, the British government awarded him the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE. The man who had deceived both sides of the world's greatest war now held decorations from each. No other agent in modern history would achieve such a paradoxical distinction. Garbo's messages during this period were among the most intricate of the war. He sent long, detailed reports about supposed troop redeployments from southern England, convoy preparations for a second main invasion, and intelligence about fuel shortages within the Royal Navy, all entirely fabricated. His radio traffic was dense, methodical, and convincing. In one transmission, he described American divisions waiting for orders in Kent to cross the Channel toward Calais, reporting constant night activity of armored units. In Berlin, Abwehr analysts translated these lines and concluded that the real blow was still imminent. Throughout July and August 1944, the German 15th Army remained immobilized near Pas-de-Calais, holding their positions, conserving their strength, awaiting Garbo's confirmation that the second invasion had begun. But that message never came. Instead, the Allies advanced rapidly from Normandy toward Paris, their armored columns slicing through the weakened German defenses. When Paris was liberated on August 25th, it was already too late for the Reich to recover. Garbo's deception had bought the Allies precious time to secure their foothold in France. Behind the scenes, the stress on Garbo was mounting. He was a man living between realities. Every message he sent, every coded word transmitted over the radio, carried the risk of exposure. Had the Abwehr suspected the truth, their retribution would have been swift and merciless, not just for him, but for his family. His wife Araceli, who had joined him in London, began to fear for their safety. She pleaded with him to end his service, but Garbo remained resolute. "The truth must never be known," he wrote to her in a letter later preserved by MI5. "If we fail in deception, thousands will die in truth." His work continued even as the war turned decisively in the Allies' favor. In September 1944, with Germany reeling from losses in France, Garbo sent reports suggesting that the Allies intended to invade Norway next. The message caused the Germans to redeploy valuable divisions northward, units that could have reinforced their desperate stand along the western front. Every false signal Garbo sent was another nail in the coffin of Hitler's crumbling empire. Inside MI5 headquarters, Garbo's files were marked most secret. Only a handful of senior officers, including Colonel Robertson and Harris, knew his full identity and the extent of his deception. He was so trusted that the British occasionally used him to test German ciphers or relay misinformation about Allied weapons development. Even after the fall of Paris, Berlin continued to request his expert assessment of Allied troop morale and logistical capacity. To the very end, they believed him. By late 1944, however, the world of espionage was beginning to collapse into chaos. The Abwehr was losing control of its networks, and the Gestapo had begun absorbing intelligence operations under the SS. Many of Garbo's contacts in Spain and Portugal disappeared. His radio transmissions became shorter, more cautious. Still, the Germans clung to his every word. One decoded Abwehr message from November 1944 reads, "Garbo remains loyal. His information is consistent. Continue transmissions." In one of his final communications to Berlin, Garbo warned that Allied forces were preparing to land in Norway to cut off Germany's northern resources. It was a fiction, but it worked. The German garrison stationed there remained until the war's end, immobilized and irrelevant. His deception, like a final whisper in the dark, outlasted the Reich itself. As 1945 dawned, London's skies were quiet again. The war in Europe was entering its final act, and Garbo's mission was nearly complete. Yet he sensed a storm brewing beyond victory, a reckoning that would follow him wherever he went. He had fooled Hitler's intelligence service, saved the Allied invasion, and lived to see both sides call him hero. But the walls of secrecy that had protected him were closing in. Once the guns fell silent, there would be no place left for a man who existed only in the shadows. And so, as the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine and Berlin braced for its fall, Agent Garbo began to plan his own disappearance. As the thunder of war subsided in 1945, Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, stood at a crossroads between worlds. For nearly 5 years, he had lived a life forged in illusion, spinning webs of deception that had steered the course of history. Yet victory brought him no peace. The Germans, still unaware of his betrayal, might one day seek vengeance. And with Europe in ruins, the old alliances of espionage were collapsing into the shadows of a new conflict. One ruled by suspicion, secrets, and the birth of the Cold War. Berlin fell in May 1945. Hitler was dead. The Abwehr, once the heart of Nazi intelligence, was dismantled by Allied occupation forces. But its archives, confiscated by the British and Americans, contain names, code numbers, and transmissions, including those of the legendary Garbo. His British handlers realized that his cover could not survive forever. If his identity were ever revealed, he and his family would be in grave danger. Soviet intelligence, now sweeping across Europe, was also searching for Nazi-linked informants and double agents. Anyone who had worked within the Abwehr network was a potential target, regardless of allegiance. Within MI5's secretive B1A section, a plan was quietly drawn up. Garbo would be retired, paid a modest pension, and officially disappeared. His handler, Thomas Harris, who had grown close to him throughout the war, arranged the falsification of his death. The story was simple. Garbo had fallen ill during a post-war mission to Angola and succumbed to malaria in 1949. MI5 even ensured that a death certificate was registered under his real name, Juan Pujol Garcia, to the world, and even to some within British intelligence. Agent Garbo was gone forever. Before vanishing, Garbo left London behind. With his wife Araceli and their children, he travelled first to Spain under a false passport, then onward to Angola, and finally settled in Venezuela under a new identity, Juan Garcia Gomez. There, in the humid outskirts of Caracas, the man who had once deceived Hitler became an anonymous expatriate. He opened a small business, taught Spanish, and lived quietly among other European immigrants who had fled the ashes of war. Few who met him knew that he had once held the fate of nations in his hands. Meanwhile, the war's intelligence community was transforming. The OSS had become the CIA. The Soviet NKVD was restructured into the KGB. Files that had once been locked in safes now circulated through the corridors of Washington, Moscow, and Berlin. Within those archives, the name Garbo occasionally resurfaced, a phantom figure credited with misleading German command during Operation Overlord. Yet no one knew where he had gone. Some believed he had indeed died of fever in Africa. Others whispered that MI5 had hidden him away, fearing retribution from surviving Nazi agents. For Garbo himself, the years in exile were marked by isolation and introspection. In letters to a former MI5 colleague, he wrote of his guilt and disconnection. "I built a life out of lies," he confessed. "Now that the truth no longer matters, I do not know who I am." The strain of living under an assumed identity weighed heavily on him. He avoided discussions of the war, speaking only vaguely of service work when asked about his past. Even his children grew up unaware of their father's role in the Allied victory. In 1954, tragedy struck when Thomas Harris, Garbo's wartime handler and closest confidant, was killed in a car crash in Spain. With Harris's death, the last man who truly understood the depth of Garbo's double life was gone. MI5 kept silent, honouring its decades-long policy of secrecy. The files on Agent Garbo were sealed under the Official Secrets Act, buried within the intelligence archives of the British government. For the world, the name faded into the background of forgotten wartime myths. But rumours persisted in the intelligence community. In the late 1960s, a few declassified Abwehr records revealed cryptic notes about Agent Arabelle, Garbo's German codename. Historians began to suspect that the British double agent system had been even more elaborate than once thought. Some questioned whether Garbo had truly died in Angola, citing the absence of verifiable records. A handful of journalists launched quiet inquiries, tracing fragments of his wartime network, yet none could locate him. In Venezuela, Garbo watched these whispers from afar, occasionally scanning European newspapers in quiet cafes. He lived modestly, his Spanish accent blending easily with the local dialect. To those around him, he was polite, reserved, and somewhat mysterious. A man who always seemed to be listening more than speaking. Only a few trusted friends noticed the oddities. His reluctance to be photographed, his aversion to discussing his past, his tendency to disappear for days into the mountains. Then, in 1971, an old acquaintance from MI5 made discreet contact, passing through Caracas under diplomatic cover. The meeting was brief and unrecorded, but afterward, Garbo wrote a cryptic note in his diary. "The past remains hidden, because the truth still serves." Whether he feared discovery by surviving Nazis, Soviet agents, or his own conscience, no one can say. He continued to live in obscurity, the ghost of a man who had fooled both empires and dictators alike. By the end of the 1970s, nearly everyone who had known Agent Garbo personally was dead or retired. The double agent who had changed the course of World War II had become a living enigma, his legend sustained only by fragments of declassified reports and the fading memories of old spies. Yet fate, as it often does, was not done with him, because soon, through the work of a curious BBC journalist, the ghost of Garbo would resurface, alive, unbroken, and ready to tell his story. For nearly 4 decades, the world believed that Agent Garbo had vanished into the mists of history. His name appeared in scattered declassified reports and obscure war histories, always ending with the same conclusion. Deceased in Angola, 1949. But in 1984, a thread pulled loose from that official story. What began as a simple BBC documentary on wartime espionage would unravel one of the greatest secrets of World War II, that the man who fooled Hitler, and by extension Moscow, had not died at all. He had simply walked off the stage. It began with Nigel West, a British author and intelligence historian researching MI5's wartime operations for a television series. While combing through newly declassified documents in the Public Record Office, West stumbled across files referring to Agent Garbo and his remarkable deception work during Operation Fortitude. Yet something didn't add up. Among the reports of his death were inconsistencies, conflicting dates, vague medical details, and references to communications long after 1949. West became convinced that Garbo might still be alive. With the assistance of former intelligence contacts, West began a quiet investigation, tracing Garbo's old network of associates across Europe. He found retired MI5 officers who hinted that Garbo's death had been an arrangement. Then, in 1984, while interviewing a former Spanish diplomat in Madrid, West received a lead. A man in Venezuela who matched Garbo's description. A reserved Spanish émigré who had once claimed to have worked in London during the war. Intrigued, West followed the trail to Caracas. There, in a modest apartment surrounded by palm trees and the hum of the tropics, West found him. Garbo, older, frail, but unmistakably the same man from wartime photographs, opened the door with cautious curiosity. After decades in hiding, he was astonished to learn that anyone still remembered him. "You found me," he said quietly with a faint smile. "I thought the world had forgotten." For 3 days, West interviewed him in secrecy. What emerged was a story that defied belief. A man who had deceived empires, saved countless lives, and then disappeared into obscurity without seeking recognition or reward. During the interviews, Garbo recounted his wartime life with remarkable clarity. He described his recruitment by the Abwehr, his move to London, the fictitious network of 27 sub-agents, and his partnership with Thomas Harris. He detailed how every false report was coordinated with MI5, and how he'd felt torn between duty and morality. "I fought not with bullets," he told West, "but with lies, and those lies became my truth." His tone carried both pride and sorrow. Pride in having contributed to victory, sorrow for the price of deception that had consumed his identity. The rediscovery of Garbo made headlines across Europe. Newspapers called him the spy who saved D-Day and the man who deceived Hitler. For the first time, the public learned how one man's imagination and nerve had kept the German 15th Army paralyzed in Calais, waiting for a phantom invasion. MI5, now decades removed from wartime secrecy, quietly confirmed the essence of his story, though many details remained classified. British veterans and historians hailed him as a hero of psychological warfare, a master manipulator who had turned disinformation into an art. In his later interviews, Garbo expressed no bitterness toward the governments that had hidden his story. He seemed content, even relieved, to finally be known. "I wanted to stop evil," he told one journalist. "I was only one man, but if one lie could save 1,000 lives, it was worth the telling." Yet he admitted that after so many years of deceit, he no longer trusted the simple nature of truth. His existence had been built upon layers of falsehood so intricate that even he sometimes struggled to separate the man from the myth. The BBC documentary, Garbo, The Spy Who Fooled Hitler, aired later that year, introducing a new generation to his remarkable deception. For the first time, audiences saw the human face behind one of the greatest espionage feats of the 20th century. Not a suave secret agent, but a soft-spoken man who had weaponized imagination against tyranny. His rediscovery reignited debates about the moral complexity of wartime intelligence. When does deception become virtue, and truth a liability? Shortly after his rediscovery, Garbo traveled to London for the first time in decades. He visited MI5's old headquarters, stood quietly outside the War Office, and laid a wreath at the cenotaph to honor those who had fought and died in the war he had helped shape from the shadows. Witnesses said he wept silently, whispering in Spanish, "At last I can say goodbye." Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, passed away in 1988 at the age of 76 in Caracas. He died not as a spy or a soldier, but as a man finally at peace with his own contradictions. His grave, modest and unmarked, rests far from the battlefields he once manipulated, yet his legacy endures in the annals of intelligence history. Even today, his story remains a cornerstone of modern espionage training, a reminder that the greatest victories of war are sometimes fought without a single shot fired. His deception not only saved lives, but changed the course of history. And though the documents of the Second World War are now fading into dust, the legend of Agent Garbo endures. The man who fooled an empire and disappeared into silence, leaving behind only the echo of his greatest lie, that he was dead.